I take your broader point that maybe we don't have to understand everything. We just kind of put what we know so far into the robot and maybe it will be enough. I'm saying what we know already is enough to say a classical computer can't be conscious.
I was just wondering, like, what do you think is sentience?
I'm treating it as more or less synonymous with consciousness, first of all. So sometimes people use the word consciousness to mean something fancier like self-consciousness or self-awareness. To me, and I think for most neuroscientists, the way we're using it is to mean if you have the capacity to feel pain, that qualifies as conscious. And I think that's more or less synonymous with sentience. Some people might use the word sentience just to mean something behavioral about your ability to respond to stimuli, but I don't think that's a useful or the usual definition. So I'm using it to be more or less synonymous with consciousness. And what does consciousness mean? It means experience. People say subjective experience. I think that's redundant. It just means experience. Anything you're experiencing is a state of consciousness. If a robot experiences something, then it is conscious. If a worm does, it is conscious. And there's a question about whether they are or not. Absolutely. But that's what I mean by consciousness or sentience. And people can take the attitude that, well, you're just giving me synonyms. That's not a definition. And so people can say, you literally don't know what you're talking about. But my answer to that is that when we started investigating electric charge, we didn't know what it was. We just gave it a name as whatever it is that makes these things push on each other. And now 100, 150 years later, we have this fancy electromagnetic theory. Arguably, we still don't know what charge actually is. We have definitions inside of our mathematical theory. And so my point is, it's unreasonable to ask for some kind of rigorous definition at the start of the investigation. We just need a word. We need to be sure we're clear that we know what phenomenon we're talking about. And that's why I want to make sure we're not confusing it with self-consciousness, for example. But the basic criterion for me is if you feel pain, if you can feel pain, you're conscious or sentient.
What if robot is intentionally designed by its developers to experience some sort of pain? Because let's say it would help robot navigate in physical world much better. I mean, it won't be pain probably in a human understanding, because I don't know if a robot will have that nervous system that humans have or like animals have, but it would be its own version of pain, like discomfort that allows it to navigate efficiently in a physical world. And in its own mind map, it will be pain. It will be like discomfort, like some form of suffering. First of all, would we be able to recognize it? Or it will be, because it's not human, we don't care about its pain. And second of all, would that be sufficient for you personally to start considering that robot as a sentient being?
The scenario you posed is somebody designed this thing to have pain, but I could interpret that different ways. One is they designed it to, when it goes into a fire, go out. To me, there's no reason to think a robot that avoids high temperatures experiences pain. But the way you phrased it it seems to say that the person who made it has some idea what they think consciousness is, so they put it into the robot. So if someone has the right theory of consciousness, in my mind, it's a physical theory. You're thinking in terms of functional criteria, I think. If it has a program that tells it to avoid, quote, pain, but there's no reason to expect it's feeling actual feelings of pain unless it has the physical basis for experience. We haven't talked about what that might be, but in order to have a fighting chance of building it into a artificial system, I think you need to understand what it is on a physical level and not just imagine that any computer that does something functionally similar must be having experiences because of that.
Do we understand human pain or animal pain on a physical level? Or we're just like, we think that we know pain just because we experience it?
When I say understand it on a physical level, I don't actually think pain or consciousness is a physical property, even though I do think it is a property of physical systems. So a physicalist, we're going all the way to the deep end right now, but a physicalist asserts that non-mental physical material or matter energy or physical system as described in physics is enough by itself when it gets the right kind of complexity or functional organization to generate consciousness. I don't think that makes sense. I think, people treat it like an intuition. You can have different opinions, but I think the hard problem is real. And people like Michael Graziano that I think you talk to who don't believe in it, I think they're missing something. And so to bring, that is not to say that I don't think we can understand consciousness scientifically. One of the questions on your list was about, will we ever have a unified theory of consciousness? I think we can, just like we did with charge. Now we have a pretty good theory that unifies it with magnetism, electricity and magnetism. But another analogy I want to make with that case is charge was a new fundamental property that we introduced into science, into physics. So occasionally we do that, and it's okay. It's not cheating. I'm suggesting we have to do that again now to account for consciousness or sentience. And that is so you can call this a panpsychist view or pan-proto-psychist or dual aspect monism. Those more or less mean the same thing to me. And it is saying that the physical world has, in addition to the physical properties like charge and mass that we've already identified, it has a mental property, an irreducible mental property. So meaning you can't just derive that from the physical, the other properties that we already have, which is what a physicalist thinks, like Graziano, that whatever this mind thing is, it just is the movement of ions in my head or something like that. I think that's incoherent ultimately when you reflect rigorously on it. And Spinoza already saw that and argued it clearly. And then Chalmers and other people said it again throughout history. And I think they're right. So basically I'm saying we have to bite the bullet and add a mental property to the physical properties we have so far to bring science, to bring consciousness, sentience into science. And then so when someone proposes that sort of step that you might call panpsychist, an immediate question that arises is known as the combination or binding problem. I would point out it's also a problem for physicalism. People talk about it more when they're talking about panpsychism, but it's so the problem is, when we're trying to understand our own human consciousness, every moment of our consciousness involves more than one feature. At least most. You might be able to try and come up with a case where that's not true, but right now I have sounds, I have things I can feel, things I can see. Even if I just limit myself to vision, there's different shapes and colors that I'm conscious of at the same time in a holistic kind of representation. If that holistic representation that I experience is going to provide a behavioral advantage, as you assumed earlier, that a robot with the experience of pain would be able to do something better than a robot that doesn't have that. If that holistic experience we have is going to have behavioral effects and be able to provide an evolutionary advantage, it cannot be a classical physical state, because every classical physical state is reducible to local interactions. If you postulate that when my brain is in such and such pattern of electrical activity, that's what it means to feel I'm seeing my grandmother. If your model of the brain is a classical model, then that experience of your grandmother must be what the philosophers called epiphenomenal. It can't have any functional effects, and so it could not have provided a behavioral advantage. And therefore, the fact that fire hurts or ripe fruit tastes good, and it seems to be giving you good advice about what to do with your hand, is a total cosmic coincidence that can't be explained within science.
What I heard, like the consciousness, sentience, were using this two terminology like interchangeably, right, in this conversation, is what it means to feel something, right? Like to feel pain, for example. You also mentioned, if I understood correctly, that consciousness, at least you're supporting like more like this panpsychism view of consciousness, that it's not only like what's happening in the brain, but it's like more, it's it's panpsychic, theory.
Sometimes I think Philip Goff is an idealist who calls himself a panpsychist. I'm not talking about bringing the whole universe in, at least not yet. I'm talking about a mental property of the physical brain. We can still keep it limited to the brain for the moment. I'm saying the physical matter in the brain has a mental property. I'm not saying I'm tapping into God's consciousness somewhere else. I'm just talking about a mental property of the matter or the physical system that is my brain.
So, but how this mental property is connected to panpsychism, or like connected to like this physical aspect of consciousness?
I'll go all the way back to how Spinoza says it, that he says the connection and arrangement of things is the same as the connection and order, or some wording like that, of ideas. So basically it's a parallelism, but it doesn't imply that like the table has an idea of itself or that the rock is conscious. I would imagine it as like elementary particles have some tiny spark of proto-sentience, but it doesn't manifest like experience that we have until it's organized into something much bigger in both a literal and kind of a information or complexity sense. Where we're going to see organized experience like ours is where there are irreducible physical holes in the physical system. So that's kind of what I was getting at when I said you have to have an idea what consciousness is physically to put it into your robot. If you just think it's a program, you're on the wrong track. I mean, essentially, Penrose proved our understanding is not just a program. Searle has a nice argument about that, the Chinese room. It's very controversial. Nobody believes it. But to me, both those arguments are basically compelling, that our conscious understanding, and I broaden that to all of our conscious experience, which is a form of inference about the world, is non-computable, to use Penrose's phrase. So that's a different argument from the binding argument that I've been emphasizing, because I think the binding argument is more accessible. We experience these holes, WHOLE in our head. And if you reflect on it carefully, that has to be epiphenomenal in a classical model of the brain. Whereas in a quantum model, if you treat the brain as a quantum system, which it is, because everything is a quantum system.
There are things we don't fully understand, but it doesn't prevent us to still like use knowledge that we have to build things. I mean, I don't know. Like, for example, when we lived in like fully classical physics world, whatever we understood, we built within like classical physics, right? Once we discovered the theory of relativity, like we started like building even more things on top of classical physics that, you know, like expanded like our capabilities as, you know, like more powerful tools that help us better understand the, you know, universe. As I understand, currently there are like physicists who say that, you know, space, there's more fundamental theory than space-time. And actually I recently watched the interview of Donald Hoffman, who was basically saying that consciousness is even more fundamental than space-time, and he's working with physicists on that. But my point is, it seems that even like physicists, they think that there are like more fundamental things than space-time. There are like more things to dig in. But even that knowledge that we have, we still, you know, like can operate, can do things within our knowledge. Where I'm going with this is that you're saying that we need to first sort of solve like the problem of consciousness, and then we will be able to build these robots who will experience pain. My argument is that maybe we don't need to solve like the problem of consciousness. Maybe whatever we know about consciousness or nervous systems, or, you know, like
Is already
different
enough.
knowledge from different you know, subjects, right? And build like robots who would experience some form of pain, maybe not fully understandable by humans, but it still will be their form of pain, their form of signaling that something is wrong.
Well,
Something
that's a
is
very different thing. I have to insist that a signal that something is wrong is absolutely different from just from an experience of pain.
Isn't it the pain? Like I experience, isn't it like the function of pain to signal me that something wrong with my system and I need to take care of it? I need to like bring my attention to something.
I think we can
Right?
say that is the function of pain. Okay, so let's say that the function of pain is to bring your attention to some damage that's happening. But that does not mean that a function that records damage is the same as experience of pain. It's not a symmetric thing. Not anything that makes a robot avoid damage will be pain. So I take your broader point that maybe we don't have to understand everything. We just kind of put what we know so far into the robot, and maybe it will be enough. I'm saying what we know already is enough to say a classical computer can't be conscious. And you can talk about different kinds of consciousnesses, and it's going to be different from ours. That's absolutely true. But I can't. But I think there's a sharp conceptual division between experience and physical signals. And I can spend more time on that if you like, but it's maybe more in the realm of what you would consider philosophy, and I can tell you about my science as well.
Yeah, I just feel like we didn't dig enough.
We have things in the world, and they have properties like mass and charge. And I'm saying we have to add another property that we'll call a mental property. And and when you organize physical things together in a certain way so that those mental properties combine, and I'm saying that only happens when the physical properties combine in a holistic way, which is quantum physical. That's why I'm saying you need a quantum substrate to get anything more than proto-consciousness. Okay, this also relates to the Orco.
To go beyond proto-consciousness. Do I understand correctly? So like your like perception of things is that everything is proto-conscious, but to form this mental model, like how do you say, like mental state?
Yeah, a mental state and experience. We could call it a mental model.
Mental state, mental like experience.
Like a
You have
human. I should be specific, like a human, because that's what I have experience with. To get something
okay.
big like this, it has to be orchestrated, to use the word from Orch OR. So remember, Orch OR stands for orchestrated objective reduction. Objective reduction is a phrase for the collapse of the wave function in quantum mechanics. The orchestrated refers to evolved biological structures that orchestrate that quantum dynamic to map it on to the personal problems of that creature. With a recipe like that, we can start to think about making conscious machines, but just it's not going to be your LLM or even a regular quantum computer.
There are like proto-consciousness around us, and we need to build, like put these material things together in a certain way so it creates this mental experience, like this mind that is capable of having experiences.
Here's a metaphor. If each electron has a pixel or a little dot of color, you need something to put it together and make my my experience of seeing a person with many pixels.
Earlier you said that it's not this integrated information theory of consciousness. It's because there's also like the system has to get to some complexity, right, to start having that conscious experience. How is it then different from Christoph Koch's theory?
And we should probably call it Tononi's theory, Giulio Tononi's theory.
Yeah, of course. I didn't like all authors, of course.
The short answer is their phi in IIT, the measure of the whole is more than the sum of its parts, supposedly, is a classical statistical measure. And so the argument I gave before applies just as much to that model as another one, as any other classical one that can be where everything can be reduced to local interactions. So in some sense, bigger things don't even exist as bigger things. They're just little things pushing on each other. But lots of people have all sorts of ways of saying IIT can't be exactly right. I highly respect Tononi for bringing the unity of consciousness into mainstream neuroscience. It was sort of ridiculed for a while by philosophers like Patricia Churchland, but to me, it's been recognized as a fundamental issue or characteristic of consciousness for hundreds of years. And it's a problem to be solved that you can call the phenomenal binding problem or the combination problem. And in my mind, a quantum substrate is the solution, because the structure of entanglement amongst all the different parts of your physical system can map onto the relationships that you perceive amongst the different features in your perception. Or just to be more, concrete, each perception is a unified whole of, in IIT, they say it's got unity, but also differentiation. In other words, information, it carries information. It's got different parts and stuff, but somehow they're all part of a irreducible whole. There are no irreducible wholes in physics outside of quantum physics, is one way to say my argument. Another thing about IIT is that their measure, another thing that's admirable about IIT is that it is clearly aspiring to be a fundamental theory. Most of the other theories out there, like a global workspace or a higher order thought, are more like metaphors. Global workspace is saying it's like a blackboard or it's like a broadcast. So probably when the frontal cortex broadcasts to the rest of that's probably conscious. How are we going to say if a computer's conscious? I don't know. This is a theory about brains. It's not a fundamental theory. But IIT is supposed to be a fundamental theory. So that's another strong point for IIT. But in my mind, the physical basis of consciousness in our brain has to be a physical state of the brain. But the measures in IIT are statistical measures, with the transition probabilities. And so that's not a description of the state right now. It's some description of if you run the identical brain 1,000 times, what are the probabilities of getting different results? So that statistical measure, as far as I can tell, is not, unless you go to a quantum description where probabilistic description is built in. But in a classical model, statistics means you just don't know all the hidden variables, and so you average over them. But there's nothing that corresponds in the real world to that average. I am a certain height. I'm not the average height of an American man, you know? And it's like IIT is trying to say consciousness is the average, is a calculation based on average probabilities of connections among all these different parts of the system. So that's a second reason I don't think it succeeds as a fundamental theory, but I admire that it aspires to be a fundamental theory, because we need a fundamental theory, not just more metaphors. And it takes the unity of consciousness seriously.
Do you remember when first time you realized that, okay, it seems that, classical neuroscience is not enough. We need to look into quantum.
It was a paper by Stapp he put it out in Henry Stapp, somewhat famous physicist. The paper was called "Why Classical Mechanics Cannot Accommodate Consciousness, but Quantum Mechanics Can," something like that. He laid it out crystal clear, more or less what I just said to you. And then I read Penrose's books and heard about microtubules, and that's what sealed the deal for me, because it seemed like they were just exactly what the doctor ordered for making this kind of dynamic in the brain. And so I've been infiltrating the academy for the past 25 years or so. And it's only in the past few years that I've talked about this stuff in publications. So I've been pursuing related issues of attention and perception by doing multi-electrode recordings in rats, but sort of in the mainstream, looking at neural synchrony and stuff like that. But only recently, with some experiments about anesthesia, I've been able to join the conversation about quantum consciousness.
If we go back to your experiments within the classical neuroscience, and then we will go to your recent experiments. What interesting findings, like from those experiments with rats, did you?
My overall program is to try and develop a model of auditory perception and attention in the rat, where you can go inside the brain with invasive experiments and do causal manipulations as a potential model of human auditory processing, and so potentially helpful in a medical way. And so some of what I've been doing is trying to observe similarities in the average electrical responses. My wires get two different kinds of signals. They're extracellular recordings, and at the high frequency, you can pick up extracellular action potentials. That's more difficult, or you don't get the data every time. But from the lower frequencies, you get the so-called local field potentials, which are analogous to EEG recordings from the scalp of humans, where you can see so-called brain waves or synchronized patterns of oscillatory synchrony or synchronization between different places. My Ph.D. was in physics, but I came over to neuroscience because I got excited about this quantum stuff. I came through computational neuroscience first, and then realized I didn't want to be begging experimentalists for their data to analyze for my whole career. So I did a second postdoc to learn how to do these multi-electrode recordings. And the reason I went for multi-electrode array recordings is to approach the binding problem from within classical neuroscience, where people are talking about how neural synchrony might contribute to a solution to how does the brain know when two signals go together in some sense.
And from classical standpoint, like what did you observe about the binding problem?
I observed a few things, but I think I would refer to other people's work to give a clear, bigger picture. But, I was interested in studying how a rat using its whiskers to judge the width of a doorway in the dark might combine signals from the two sides, or just in a detection task where the rat is listening for a beep and will get a reward if it licks for a beep. We could see correlates with the synchronization state of the rat's brain with how well they were paying attention. And so roughly what we have seen is in line with what other people have seen in monkeys and humans, where there are states of low frequency coherence that are sort of like inattention, or maybe paying attention to internal things instead of external things, and higher frequency. It's more complicated than this, but the higher frequency, gamma frequencies, 40 hertz and above, might be associated with externally directed attentions.
Some waves go internally, some waves go externally.
That's how I said it, but as I was saying it, it's true the way you just said it. The way I said it with frequencies, when I said it with frequencies, I realized there's a low frequency that's also involved in attention externally, so that can get confusing. But yes, there seem to be different waves even involved in encoding versus sending out a motor command is kind of routed by different oscillations. And then sort of the other part of our work has been, aside from a paper with the single units, action potentials, just looking at neural correlates of perceiving a beep, trying to dissociate that from neural correlates of the rat telling us whether it heard the beep or not by licking on one side or the other.
Do we know by collecting all these signals, and basically as I understand, the binding problem is like building the perception in one coherent representation, right? Like getting signals and building like into one coherent representation of reality that we perceive. Do we know where exactly in the brain it happens?
I think let's see. I want to distinguish that we can talk about a computational binding problem as distinct from what I called the phenomenal binding problem of how to account for the unity of consciousness. So computationally, there's an issue if you have a bunch of red detectors and you have triangle and square detectors, and you see red triangles and green squares. There's an issue of if you have neurons that are firing saying, I see triangle and square, and I see red and green, and they're in different places. How do you bind it together so that you know you're seeing green triangle and red square as opposed to the other combination? So even if we were not conscious at all, that would be a computational problem that might need to get solved.
It's still an unsolved problem.
There's potential answers or beginnings of answers. So neural synchrony is a start of an answer. That is, you could say, and maybe there's some evidence of things like this, that if you're looking at a green square and a red triangle, then you might have alternating synchronous firing of the red. I forget which way I put them together, but the ones that go together would fire at the same time. And then you'd go through a slower oscillation, and the next object would have all its parts represented as by spikes firing at the same time. It does seem, you asked where does that binding happen? I think the consensus is the neural correlate of each conscious moment is distributed. It's not in one spot. It's a distributed pattern of activity. All the way back to Descartes. From Descartes to Francis Crick, people were looking to answer the question the way you asked it. Where is the place in the brain where it all comes together? And there are some places, and Crick, right before he died, thought the claustrum, an obscure spot in the thalamus, was the answer. And Descartes noted, also reasoning on the basis of the binding problem, noted that anatomically we have two copies of most of the things in our brain, the hemispheres and our thalamus and amygdala, hippocampus, but the pineal body looks like it's the only thing that there's just one of it in the brain. And so I think that's why Descartes thought that's where our mind talks to our brain, is by pushing on the pineal body. And I think the reasoning was everything else is doubled, but our
What is a pineal
pineal
body?
body or pineal gland is just it has to do with day night regulation of the cycle. It's just a part of our brain, kind of in the middle. And most things are doubled, and that just looks like a little pine nut, actually. I think that's why it's called a pineal body.
I'm just trying to internalize. So you said that from computational standpoint, we start having some answers, but it's still not final.
Right. You can imagine. So they talk about static binding or binding by convergence and dynamic binding. So if there's to imagine, okay, to recognize a face, you need to see that it has eyes and mouth, say. So say you have some eye detector neurons and a mouth detector neuron. You can just have those send their outputs to another neuron that will only fire if it gets both eye and mouth inputs. So that's a way of doing computational binding if you've learned or you kind of already know what combinations of things you're looking for. But it seems that we also need a mechanism for what's called dynamic binding for new combinations, which really every moment of experience is a new combination of sensory features. And that's where synchrony is sort of a main idea. It's only a partial solution to the computational problem. And I'm arguing there's no classical solution to the phenomenal binding problem.
Phenomenal is a dynamic binding problem.
No, I'm sorry. When I use that, that's what philosophers use to refer to consciousness. So it's the consciousness binding problem or the sentience binding problem as opposed to the computational binding problem, which you might have in just a unconscious robot.
So phenomenal binding problem is the same as consciousness binding.
Or you could call it the problem of the unity of consciousness.
But it's not dynamical binding.
No, sorry, that still falls potentially within classical neuroscience. But I think I'm suggesting that there's close relationship between the dynamic binding and consciousness. So dynamic binding might be the way we refer to what happens on the signal processing level, where phenomenal binding is how we refer to the experience of the whole. But yes, I think the ultimate solution to the dynamic binding problem that I think will involve a quantum solution, it'll sort of be the same as the solution to the phenomenal binding problem.
So do I understand correctly that from classical neuroscience standpoint, we don't have like clear answer to dynamical binding problem?
I think that's fair to say. There might be some people that just think it's just because it's complicated and interactions of these different frequencies of classical waves might be enough to account for how everything gets done. I guess I can't say that's ruled out. It's really only by looking at my own consciousness that I say that's ruled out.
What I'm wondering, and I'm just curious if you thought about it before. Let's assume there are like quantum effects happening inside the brain that cause these moments of consciousness. But have you ever thought that Orch OR theory of Penrose and Hameroff is not that theory that correctly describes those quantum effects? Maybe there is another theory yet to be developed that would truly sort of confirm those quantum mechanical effects. The reason why I'm asking this because the Orch OR theory sort of has been, controversial, right? And since it has been around for like decades, we don't see. I don't know why we don't see sort of progress. Is it because nobody believes?
We do. So we've spent too much time talking about philosophy. There has been experimental progress.
No, but I'm trying to understand, like, do you think that you might be like super biased towards one theory instead of exploring different theories that also match, quantum mechanics like framework? That's my question, basically.
That's a possibility, of course. But I have considered a bunch of other ones, and I think I have principled reasons for preferring Orch OR. And now when we say Orch OR, it has a bunch of parts, and we could we could take some of them and leave some of them. For example, Penrose has his own particular scheme for how the wave function collapses. Maybe another wave function collapse model turns out to be correct. We could just transplant that into Orch OR, and I don't think we even need to give it a different name. But there's this whole class of quantum models that don't believe in wave function collapse. You got your many worlds, you got various flavors of people that think it's just a feature of our knowledge, not a feature of the real world. So objective reduction, the objective there means it's a physical process. It's not just us updating our model of the physical process. So I think there's reasons to believe that within quantum mechanics already, but I'm not pretending I'm an expert on all the arguments and theorems they've got. But I think there's even some experimental evidence favoring what they call the ontic interpretation as opposed to epistemic, that it's a real objective physical process. Just in the wide space of quantum theories and people who try to apply them to the brain and consciousness, you got those that involve objective reduction. There's about one of those. And then you got all the other ones that are trying to avoid, that are trying to pretend that wave function collapse doesn't really happen. To me, and apparently to Penrose, that doesn't make sense. You know, the whole fable about Schrodinger's cat, it says that if you leave off the collapse, if you just follow the Schrodinger equation, you're supposed to see cats that are alive and dead at the same time. We don't see that. So it seems like we've known for 100 years that you can't throw away the measurement postulate and still have quantum theory. I mean, if you don't do measurements, you don't get predictions to compare. You can't compare predictions. So I take the viewpoint that the collapse is real. But moreover, my central argument here is the binding problem, the irreducible objective unity that must go with our experienced moments of consciousness. I said that only happens in quantum physics. That's true, but it's more than that. It's that only happens at the moment of collapse. You hear a lot of talk about entanglement as the basis for unity, but entanglement develops completely locally by a local differential equation, just like in classical mechanics. That is the Schrodinger equation. You can see it's got a ddt and it's got dx's on the other side. So everything's local in space, but also local in time. But my main point here is it's local in space. So everything is reducible to local interactions. All the spooky action at a distance, the non-locality, the irreducible holism happens at the moment of collapse. And so that's why I think I prefer a theory that involves the moment of collapse, because that's the only spot in physics where there is irreducible holism, known as non-locality, usually.
What I understood is that the moment of collapse, this is the convincing argument for you.
To sum it all up, the binding problem, the unity of consciousness is what leads me to quantum physics. And then there's a finer point, which is that even when you're in quantum physics, everything is local until the moment of collapse. So that's why that seems.
Can you elaborate on everything is a moment until the collapse?
Everything is local until the collapse. So that means if your theory says, okay, we're going to solve the phenomenal binding problem by equating the substrate of consciousness with an entangled quantum state, and you say the unity is counted for by the entanglement, I'm saying even entanglement develops locally, so that I think in principle you can describe the whole system in terms of just little parts acting on each other, and you never need to refer to that whole big thing. You know, as I'm saying that, I think that part of my argument is weaker than the rest of it. So that is my reasoning. I'm admitting it's not airtight, but I think quantum physics without collapse doesn't really make sense. Arguably, what happens in the state before you make a measurement isn't really happening in the real world. Things don't happen until they are actualized. Before that, they are just probability amplitudes evolving in some kind of imaginary time or something. I still lean, even though I just admitted it's not a proof, I guess, maybe. I think objectively, even the manifestation of the non-local correlations doesn't happen until you make a measurement. And so that's when we have something in physics that could correspond to the holistic states that we experience.
There are like those lots of entanglements happening right throughout the brain, and it's like sort of distributed. And the moment when that collapse happens, we get this unified sort of perception.
Right. Maybe it's like this, you know, the Necker cube where you can see it two ways. Are you familiar with that? Or anyway, pictures where you can see it two ways, like it's an old woman or a young woman,
Sure.
rabbit or
like, is it a duck or rabbit?
Duck or rabbit.
Yeah.
So there are things like that. You can imagine duck has a pattern of activity that would correspond to that perception, and rabbit has a different one. And so before the collapse, it might be in a superposition of duck and rabbit, but you're only going to experience one of them.
After collapse, you experience one of them.
Right. So it's not that, you know, you do have the entanglement and patterns of entanglement before the collapse, but it's like superpositions of different patterns of entanglement. One pattern of entanglement might be the rabbit. One pattern, it might be the duck. Until the collapse happens, the state hasn't decided which one is going to be actualized. And actualized here means perceived or experienced.
Basically, what I'm trying to, understand, and then not necessarily we will sort of get to the bottom of things. We're just like discussing, right? Like we're like, in this sort of, I don't know, darkness, like trying to like shed light to things. Yeah. What I understood, like for you, the collapse is what is like important event that sort of defines like the outcome. But what I'm trying to understand, do you think that Orch OR theory is the only theory that can potentially describes that collapse correctly? Maybe there are like other theories that could be developed that also could describe this collapse, and that would fit into, experiments.
Absolutely. So I tried to say that earlier, that there might be some other mechanism of OR besides the one that Penrose suggested. That still I'm willing to consider. I haven't really seen that theory. The other part is the microtubule part.
How we're attached to microtubules.
Yes. Why are we so? Why are we obsessed with microtubules? So
is it something that we should like? We can't rule out, like we only attach to microtubules, and that's happen only there, nowhere else in the brain.
When you talk to AI people, they're thinking about human consciousness and whether we can put it in artificial things. But on the biology side, like when you talk to Michael Levin, he's thinking about, should I think, he sort of avoids the word consciousness, but he's thinking about things in biology. Should we consider them sentient or intelligent or whatnot? For me, microtubules gives a very natural way to see how our consciousness came from something similar that's been there all along in living systems. And microtubules, what they do in single cells is integrate sensory signals and coordinate movement. And that's what our brain does. So it's like they're just doing a fancier version of what they've been doing all along in biology. So it shows how the concept of life is not about DNA. It's connected to consciousness ultimately, or there's a sort of continuity. Anil Seth, mainstream neuroscientist, talks about this. And, you've got everybody on one side saying there's no, in principle, reason that you shouldn't be able to make a conscious thing out of silicon. And Anil Seth's the one guy, or one of the few guys, who's saying, well, maybe biology has something essential, but he's not sure what it is. The special thing that biology has is the microtubules, because they seem to be built to do all sorts of quantum things. And when you said, why hasn't there been progress? We've gotten a lot now since the time when everyone was laughing at this, and everyone is still laughing at this. But now we have a lot of experimental evidence from Bandyopadhyay, from theoretical evidence from Travis Craddock and his lab, experimental evidence from Kurian's lab of superradiance, quantum superradiance in microtubules at room temperature. You know, the thing was always, it's too warm. You can't do quantum at room temp or at body temperature. Now we know they're doing amazing things at room temperature and in living neurons, even in Bandyopadhyay's experiments. And since we're on microtubules, let me bring up, so one thing in favor of them is what they do lets us understand consciousness as just the most recent version of this thing that biology does, our consciousness. The other thing is, okay, how does this connect with regular neuroscience? We know that action potentials on the electrical signals on the membranes of neurons is how we get sensory information, and it's how we move our body, how I talk. So if this microtubule idea is correct, the microtubules must have a way to talk to the spikes, to talk to the membrane potential. And the membrane potential must be able to talk to the microtubules to tell the microtubules what's going on outside. And moreover, if the idea here is the substrate of our consciousness is a quantum state of the microtubules, and I said my main motivation was the binding problem, to explain how a color over here could get combined with a shape over here. In order for that to happen, I need not just quantum coherence within a neuron, but across many neurons. But Bandyopadhyay already has experiments showing the resonances, the vibrations that the microtubules do spread across neurons and control spiking activity on the membrane. There's another guy in South America whose lab has also shown local field potential signals, the brain waves I was talking about, the classical brain waves, are controlled by microtubule oscillations in the honeybee brain.
Do you remember his name?
Horacio Cantiello. Honeybee brain oscillations are generated by microtubules. He's got a series of these papers. That was 2021.
Do you think in non-living organism, because microtubules is a property of biological life, right? In non-living, basically in non-biological material, could there be observed similar quantum mechanic effects that if we put them together, it will give the same basically outcome? It will have the same properties of that phenomenal binding that we observe in biological life. I mean, what I'm trying to discuss here is that can we observe something similar in non-biological?
I think in principle, the answer is yes. In practice, we don't have a consciousness detector yet, although there's some interesting, I don't know what to think about them. There's some interesting experiments by a guy in Texas, Heleskar, who's got an optical phenomenon that seems to, it's a diffraction phenomenon that when he puts it next to a living thing, it makes a certain, the pattern is the interference pattern that you see is somewhat dimmed or diminished compared to if he puts it next to non-living things. And he's done all these controls and stuff. And he speculated that maybe it has to do with actually OR. I mean, it seemed very far off to be able to test the OR part of this hypothesis. Testing the quantum part, we're starting to do that. We're starting to get evidence, but the OR part seems more difficult to test. But maybe this guy in Texas has a phenomenon that actually somehow depends on the amount of OR or something, or the scale of OR that's happening next to it. And so maybe we're closer to a consciousness detector than we think. But it would be something like that, which we don't have yet, to really know what you're doing. To really know what you were doing, we need to complete the theory. OR is a good framework and is enough to say, I don't think a classical computer can ever be conscious the way we talk about in ourselves. But even with just OR as we have it, maybe combined with active inference that maybe we'll talk about, maybe that would be enough, as you said, as you suggested earlier, even before we understand everything, maybe we could make a synthetic consciousness and maybe convince ourselves it was.
I'm just trying to understand, is there like a fine line between non-living organism and living organism, right?
Yeah, so I tend to think, now stepping somewhat outside of my expertise, I guess, but within biology, I tend to think what makes something alive is, in the textbooks, they define it in terms of replication and metabolism, and there's probably a couple other things. But to me, it's the metabolism is the real thing, and doing it in a way that may involve OR even in a single cell. So we haven't talked about anesthesia yet, but it turns out the same gases that make us reversibly unconscious without killing us do something analogous to everything alive, including plants. So movement processes seem to slow down or stop.
Do you know if it was applied, for example, to viruses?
That's a good question that I do not know the answer to. And so, I've looked into whether, or I haven't looked in deeply to this, but whether viruses have microtubules. I think they don't have microtubules, but they have some kind of tubular proteins that may be analogous. And, maybe in an artificial thing, we'd use carbon nanotubes or something, but we're probably going to be better off using
biology.
Right. Yeah. who kind of knows what it's doing already. I was just trying to make the point about
anesthesia.
Right, that it applies to everything. And so it seems plausible to me that some level of something like consciousness, maybe we want to call it proto-conscious when it's simpler, but maybe OR is part of what it means to be alive, not just conscious. But that doesn't mean limited to biological, to natural biological.
We potentially can design something.
Right. I don't know if it's a good idea, but
has the same response to this anesthesia, right?
True.
And then
that would be one
question,
data point. So we would try to have, a bunch of different, if we built it out of something different, it might not be sensitive. It probably wouldn't be sensitive to the same anesthetics. So that's probably not a general test. The anesthetics may be operating on microtubules, but if we make something out of carbon nanotubes that's conscious, it might not be sensitive to the same molecules as anesthetics. That's just a detailed question.
But would it be conscious or not? It could be conscious, right?
Yeah, if it's
sophisticated enough to have this.
Basically, I think the criterion is if it has orchestrated its objective reduction in such a way that it somehow represents something about itself. This is where the unsolved problems are. But active inference might be a part of specifying that more rigorously. But if the collapse somehow maps on to what that thing actually is, or some aspect of its existence, then that's where I can start to imagine it's plausible that it might have, qualia or experience associated with it.
Basically, you're saying that we can only build something like that only with quantum mechanics approach. We can't build that phenomenal binding creature that might not necessarily have microtubules, but in a classical way.
Yes, that's my main point.
Also, you mentioned active inference. Actually, I spoke with Carl Friston last week, but for people who are not familiar with that terminology, can you please elaborate what active inference is and how it's applied to consciousness and living organisms?
I've got two sets of slides here, one about the binding stuff, and this is more about the active inference stuff. Leading up to what active inference is, I'm going to try and keep this brief. But basically, in the last century, we understood neurons in terms of signal processing, deterministic differential equation models. You might have heard of the Hodgkin and Huxley model. It's a bunch of, it's like Newton's laws for neurons that say if you put this much charge in it, it will spike or it will not spike. But this author said there's recently been a quiet paradigm shift from signal processing that I'm roughly equating with that deterministic kind of modeling to probabilistic inference for studying perception. And active inference falls under that framework. And so in this framework, each agent, each person is a set of beliefs, and what beliefs about the outside world and yourself say. And what beliefs are in this formalism are probability distributions of that various states of the world might be the case. Okay, so in this formula I've got on the screen here, this is Bayes' rule. We don't have to go into that, but in this formula, S is representing states of the world that I'm trying to infer, and O are my sensory inputs, observations, or we can think of it as outcomes later on. But so what this formula is about updating your beliefs about what the state of the world is based on your most recent observations. Okay, so that's how it's probabilistic inference. You're trying to infer what is my best interpretation of what I'm seeing in front of me based on what I already know. I won't go into details, but so this is a generalization of a prediction error framework, where the idea is the way we learn about the world is by having some beliefs. Those beliefs make predictions about what we're going to see. We see the real case, and the difference between the actual observation or outcome and our prediction is the prediction error, and we adjust our model based on that prediction error. And so this whole framework is a generalization of that idea of learning from your errors, or learning from the difference between your predictions or your beliefs and what you actually saw.
And I understand like it's like minimizing the surprise.
Yes, I'll show in a couple slides how we can interpret it that way. So far, what I've described here is what they call probabilistic coding, where you're talking about perceptual coding. What should I believe about what I'm looking at? Active inference is a next step where you now include your own behavioral response among the states of the world. So in a sense, you're predicting what's out there, and you're also predicting what you're about to do. And it's a weird kind of thing where you bias your predictions towards things that you would prefer to happen. So it's not pure prediction, but it's got an element of preference in it as well. So also surprise is also mixed in with disappointment.
I mean, I just referring to what Carl said. Basically, he said like you're like trying to minimize surprise. That's why I said
the way do we get to that? Here's the slide that says that. So we start off with this formula, this probabilistic formula about how you update your belief, your probability about the states of the world based on a recent observation. But it turns out to do this right, you need these probability distributions. You need like a list of all the things that could happen and a good estimate. And so this is intractable for most real problems. And so there's an approximate formalism where, instead of solving that exactly, you do still a fairly sophisticated mathematical procedure, but instead you are minimizing a quantity based on these probability distributions, based on your beliefs, that can be called free energy or surprise or the negative of self-evidence. So another way you can think of what an agent is in this formalism is you are a model of the world that produces these probability distributions about what happens. This model that produces beliefs. The probability you calculate for the observations you see, if it's large, that's evidence for your model. At least roughly intuitively. And so the opposite of that is if you have low evidence, if what happens is low probability, that's surprise, kind of equivalent to disappointment. And the mathematical name he gives to the quantity we're calculating is free energy. The reason it's analogous to an energy in statistical physics is simply that higher energies are less likely. So we're just trying to find the most likely state of affairs in the world and the most likely action that I'm going to do next. And that most likely here can be interpreted as optimal. So it's a way to, it's like an algorithm for producing optimal beliefs and optimal actions based on the preferences that I mentioned are built in. Just on here, I'll mention that there's a bunch of, so when you do this approximation method, you end up with a bunch of different variables representing beliefs about this, beliefs about that. And what's remarkable is pathways in the brain seem to map quite well onto variables in this formalism, and even changes in activity and changes in pathology seem to map on to the formalism. So it seems like there's good evidence the brain does something like this in order to act optimally.
But we sort of found proof of this through classical methods, right?
This is a classical theory, and so far I haven't said anything about consciousness. It's just about a way to have optimal beliefs and optimal actions.
Basically, I'm trying to understand where consciousness fits in your theory or your perception of consciousness, where it fits in this classical model of active.
In the active inference literature, there's a few different ways that people try to identify which part of the algorithm might be conscious. I think the one I'm going to pick basically is what they call counterfactual or temporal depth. And it's a fancy sounding term, but all it refers to is a fast implicit planning response. So in other words, there's a version of active inference that just sort of does reflex responses. It tries to calculate based on the sensory input at this moment, what's the best thing I should do next. But there's a little bit more sophisticated version that integrates for a little bit and tries to, you could say, imagine different things that might happen in the future over some number of time steps to pick which is the best, which action will give you the best outcome, not like right now, but after some time. So it's like, it's just like a person imagining different things they might do before deciding.
The process of imagining, it's something that only conscious.
I call that an implicit planning process. So it's like when you consciously imagine I could go to this restaurant or that restaurant, but each moment of consciousness is being generated in 200 or 300 milliseconds based on unconscious activity. So it integrates for 200 or 300 milliseconds and then decides what it's going to see, what you're going to see, and what you're going to do.
In my imagining,
during that 200 milliseconds, you weren't imagining anything. So that's why I'm calling it implicit.
It's just like computation that happens.
Right. It's as if the brain went through all the different scenarios for what might happen in the next 10 seconds and then choose what to do based on what's best overall instead of what's best immediately right now, like a reflex.
Where consciousness fits in here, is it like the process of imagining
it's
things?
the output of that implicit planning process.
Basically the decision that I make, okay, I'm going to like this restaurant.
Exactly. A slow version is deciding, okay, this restaurant costs more, but it tastes better, stuff like that. But what I'm talking about now is something that happens just in a fraction of a second when someone throws up a new stimulus and your brain has to decide what it's going to see. It takes a couple hundred milliseconds. And during that time, you can understand it under the active inference formalism as going through different interpretations, but not just including this moment, but simulating possible futures before that moment of experience.
Going back to AI systems, they do
that, yes.
To some, yeah, they do that, and I'm pretty confident they will be doing it much better and better over time.
Yes.
So they can make those decisions.
Yes.
They can do predictions. My point is,
why aren't they conscious?
Yeah. I mean, like, maybe we don't need even consciousness to have the system that performs active inference.
Absolutely not. Of course, yes. You can simulate this on a computer, a classical computer, and I don't believe it will be conscious. It might convince some people that it's conscious. It might behave like something conscious. In the papers that I sent you, I argued, though, that a classical, so my earlier argument was sort of in principle, kind of absolute. Unless I've really made a mistake, I think the classical model is ruled out. But I also, in the active inference paper, I made an argument that's not a logical proof kind of argument, but a plausibility argument that it looks like classical computers are not fast enough to do the very sophisticated simulations that I was just describing in only 200 milliseconds. And yeah, basically that. Whereas Orch OR, the punchline sort of is that the mathematical description of quantum physics maps on to active inference. So a quantum version of that is how the universe decides what it's going to do next at each moment. And the suggestion is our brain has found a way to map our personal problems, our biological problems, onto that physical dynamic, which what it is doing is optimizing. We say it minimizes the physical action, but that's an optimization problem. It's doing an optimization problem that's way beyond the computation, because quantum states carry, in principle, infinite quantum information. It's like nature is keeping track of crazy amounts of information in every bit of matter and doing this optimization calculation. It seems like life is taking advantage of that universal dynamic for our own personal problems.
It actually sounds very poetic.
But as far as, yeah, I think it does kind of map onto certain philosophical or religious perspectives. I think you're asking about, so active inference can do all this stuff where it has purposes and acts with agency and so on. But I stick by my argument that if it's a classical system, it won't have real experience. It's just going to be a robot acting. It's going to be a zombie.
Zombie that does everything what human does.
I guess
or like
the last part of my argument is that it won't be able to be as fast as it'll be like a very slow zombie. A classical computer can do in principle, can do any computation that a quantum computer can do, but it can't do it as fast.
Can I just clarify here one thing? I mean, computers already fast than humans. That their reaction is way faster than reaction of humans. When you're saying that they can do things fast, what exactly you're referring to?
To do a realistic active inference model, like a human level active inference model, my contention is that with today's best computers, you won't get it to act fully human at the speed we do. So yes, our signals are going very slowly. But if you think about the computations that we do in 200 milliseconds, we're keeping track of multiple syllables, like 24 syllables in the past of what's been said. And we're trying to, and under the active inference formalism, we're simulating very large numbers of possibilities. There's a combinatorial explosion there, exponential explosion in terms of the processing power that you would need to represent all the possibilities. And then I have specific arguments about the way that neural models So I'm talking about if you try to make a classical computer work the way, according to active inference, simulating neural dynamics, the way we think the brain works, it's going to go very slow. But maybe you could write a program to do that in a different architecture very quickly. But if you try to simulate the way the brain does it, I'm saying this is an argument not that classical machines can't do it, but that a classical brain couldn't do it. If we model the brain as a classical machine that is not our best transistors and stuff, but is a bunch of neurons that have to integrate charge and send slow signals, those classical neural models are what are too slow, not classical computers in general.
I would check what is the speed of processing that classical computers do, but what you're saying is that
it's the problem space is so huge that we do at each moment of our consciousness.
Speed in which our neurons processing information.
Right. If you model them as classical neurons, and we have detailed ways of modeling how they work, it appears to me, they have to do a bunch of matrix multiplication that requires linear summation and multiplication operations. There's these log representations of the probabilities and raw probabilities. There's the many possibilities I mentioned, the combinatorial explosion. When you put them all together, and these are all supposed to work by attractor dynamics. So that's another thing that makes them even slower than just the fact that they're sending messages at 50 meters per second instead of near light speed. The other thing that makes them slow is in these classical models, you remember things by dynamical attractors. So those are states of activity that the network tends to go to, stable states of activity or stable patterns of activity. And just, I teach the computational neuroscience class, and in my experience and in people saying it in the literature, those things take hundreds of milliseconds to reach one sort of sample. And these probabilistic models, you need a bunch of samples to get a decent answer. Moreover, these attractor states that you need to sort of converge onto over some amount of time, they're going to get destabilized because the whole time you're getting new sensory inputs that are changing what's happening. So it's not easy for it to just settle into a stable attractor activity pattern. So there's a whole bunch of ways that it seems it just can't be as amazingly efficient as we are, despite our reputation for having slow hardware. The computations we're doing on a moment-to-moment basis are truly astounding when you really figure out.
And imagine we had such a complex system inside us, and we're complex systems, and on what we're spending our time, doing some I don't know, arguing on social media and
Right.
I don't know, doing some stupid things.
Bandiopod here.
Not even realizing what amazing thing happening.
Yeah, that's what Hameroff says. He says
some bullshit on social media.
Right. Bandiopod here says trying to understand neurons by only studying the membrane is like trying to understand an animal by only studying the skin.
I think Stuart said that, yeah, when I spoke with
him.
He
says it's doing a disservice to neurons. It's disrespectful to neurons.
Yeah, disrespectful to neurons. What are your sort of future plans in terms of? I mean, we didn't specifically cover your work, conscious active inference, but I think we
touched on it. The suggestion is simply, I think classical neurons are too slow to do those active inference computations, but the mathematical formulation of OR is equivalent to the so-called path integral formulation of active inference, of a conscious agent in active inference, simulating possible futures and optimizing them. And so, whereas the classical model has a problem figuring out how we could get neurons to do that, the OR model seems to have it built in. And it also accounts for the fact that we have discrete, non-overlapping perceptual cycles. I can elaborate on that if you're interested.
I'm interested in how you see your future work in proving your theory? Basically, what are your thoughts? Like, what kind of experiments you're planning to conduct? Or, I mean, again, I'm not an expert. I was just consulting with Claude when I was reading your conscious active inference, the second paper that has this empirical evidences, but it seems like there's still not solidified, proof, right? I'm just wondering how you're thinking to move forward towards, bringing more arguments.
There's experimental side and theoretical side. On the experimental side, I guess before I say what I want to do, I want to mention MRI experiments by Kerskens and Perez, where they set their MRI machine to unconventional parameters to try and isolate an entanglement signal. They say they found a signal that they can't account for classically, and it correlates both with the conscious state when someone fell asleep in the scanner and with working memory performance. So that seems to be direct biophysical evidence of a macroscopic quantum state in the living human brain that is not only there, but seems to be related to consciousness and cognitive function. So that's another avenue of experimental evidence that people are not engaging with. So Claude will still say there's no evidence, or people don't believe this, and people don't believe that MRI evidence. But those are Bandiopadhyay's experiments and Cantiello. These MRI kinds of experiments are some ways of approaching it. I want to continue with anesthesia experiments. We just published another paper showing that it seems that the anesthetic that we used on rats and mice also works on microtubules to make single-celled swimmers slow down and reverse.
Oh, you already published the
Yes,
paper.
yes.
Okay,
So we did
okay. I
that.
will include it in the description.
So we did that. So I want to. There's some interesting things besides the basic result that we want to follow up on. Maybe try some other microtubule drugs. So there's some anesthesia work like that, figuring out how microtubule drugs interact with anesthesia, basically, and that's providing evidence that anesthesia or some anesthetics operate on microtubules to make us unconscious. On the experimental side, I would like to imitate Bandiopadhyay a little bit. So he's got amazing equipment for measuring very high frequency oscillations of the microtubules, but it seems there's a cheap machine that you can just put on your head to measure a certain frequency range that seems to be relevant. And so I would like to get one of those things. And it's the megahertz range. It seems to be a major band sort of for the microtubule oscillations. And so I'd like to see maybe how, if we can measure microtubule related peaks, resonances that go away or change under anesthesia on the experimental side. That would provide sort of spectroscopic kind of evidence.
Microtubules at least involved.
Right. And electromagnetic vibrations, it wouldn't necessarily prove the quantum side, but makes it more and more plausible. And then on the theoretical side, some evidence we haven't talked about is there's a big literature on what's called quantum cognition, where you can study people's choices or judgments about sensory stimuli or answers to questions. And when you study the statistics of their answers to questions, you can find, logical fallacies and various patterns that seem to be understandable under a quantum model of cognition. Making these people that write these papers don't make assumptions about whether the brain has to be quantum. There's just using a quantum kind of probability description. And you can explain a bunch of irrational things we judge and statistics of question answers. That same formalism might apply to the perception of ambiguous figures, like I mentioned before, seeing the rabbit or the duck. Those kind of situations are good for studying consciousness because the stimulus is staying the same, but the experience is changing. So when the experience changes, it's not just because you changed the stimulus, it's something happening in the brain that's changing the perception. So those kinds of situations are useful for studying consciousness. And one of the main ways in mainstream neuroscience is what's called binocular rivalry, where if you project two different images to the two eyes, which you can do just using 3D glasses, you don't need very fancy equipment. But if the two eyes get two different images that are so different that they can't be fused into 3D, then instead of just seeing the overlapping both of them, you see one for a while and then it switches to the other one.
There already been this
Oh yes,
experiment.
for a long time. So, and we've seen single neuron correlates of that in monkeys and fMRI correlates in humans. And you can see, basically we have a face area and a place area. And so you can use images of houses and faces, and you can see the picture that they're looking at stays the same. But when they see the house, you see the house area light up more
Area.
and faces. That's a good way to see neural correlates of consciousness. But I'm thinking, or I think there's already some evidence that the statistics of how it changes between possible perceptions might reveal quantum signatures, like in the quantum cognition literature. And maybe we could model those and show whether a classical model could reproduce that or not. So that's one kind of thing I'm thinking about. And also trying to make simple quantum active inference models and see how they behave. Like, for example, there's an amazing quantum model from 2005, Smooth Pursuit, how we can follow a moving target with our eyes, even when it's somewhat noisy. And their quantum model, it was just assuming if there was a quantum system in the brain that we could program with neural activities, and it didn't make any hypothesis about what it might be. It said if there was, here's how we could use it to track moving objects, moving targets. And they compared it to the classical models, and it did much better. And not only did it perform better, it also qualitatively made every once in a while discontinuous jumps, which the classical model was just following it smoothly as best as it could. But the quantum one did occasional discontinuous jumps, which apparently is in the real human eye tracking data. So it reproduces that.
And what does that suggest? What those jumps, what does it mean? How to interpret it?
I'm not mapping it onto objective reduction. It's sort of suggestive of that. But just that the quantum model produced a qualitative feature that's in the real data that you don't see from a classical model, at least that classical model. So that's somewhat supportive. And it also performed better, quite a bit better. So I have argued that model was essentially instantiating active inference, more or less by the same argument I said already, that the quantum dynamics are instantiating active inference. But I'd like to be able to generalize it or see it work for myself. So maybe I'll study active inference models of smooth pursuit or binocular rivalry, see if binocular rivalry, whether the statistics of how it changes maybe shows quantum signatures, like our judgments or answers to questions appear to show quantum contextuality, they call it. I had one further thought about a paper I'm trying to get published now is about a definition of the word physical. And this is related to what we were talking about at the beginning, why I think there really is a hard problem. A way that people can be in doubt about that is we're not sure what physical means. We have things that we think are physical, like mass and charge, but some thinkers, some authors say, well, maybe in the future we'll just add consciousness as a new physical property, and so then it would be part of our physical theory. And then you could call yourself a physicalist instead of a panpsychist. But in my mind, there is really a sharp, clear distinction between what we call physical properties and non-physical properties. And I'm saying consciousness is a non-physical property. And so to make that meaningful, I have to say what physical means. And it turns out in the philosophical literature, this is not well settled because, if you try to define physical in terms of properties that are in physics now, that's not good enough because there might be some new properties in the future, in physics in the future. So that can't be the way we define physical, just by saying it's whatever properties are in physics now. And you can't say it's whatever properties are in physics in the future because we don't know what that's going to be. But I think there's a way we can already define physical properties in a way that will last forever. And it relates to you bringing up the issue of whether space and time are fundamental or not as well. But basically, my contention is that a physical property is a property that constrains or determines or influences movement in space. Electric charge is a physical property because it influences how things move in space. But that's true of every other property in a physical theory, like spin, all these fancy quantum properties. They're physical because they influence or constrain where things can be in space. And when I phrase it in terms of motion, that shows I'm assuming a concept of space and I'm assuming a concept of time. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to define movement. An objection to that as well, all these physicists are saying space and time are not fundamental. So you can't base your definition on that because we might get rid of space and time. But no, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of space and time.
Oh, we can expand upon, right? Like we didn't get rid of classical physics, right? But we discovered like it sort of fits into like quantum mechanics.
Even if we decide that space and time emerge from some more fundamental reality, Hoffman's consciousness or whatnot, the theory cannot do without space and time, because if it's going to make predictions, that's what a scientific theory does. It says what's going to happen at a particular time when you set it up in a particular way. So we are never going to get rid of space and time. And so it annoys me when people say time is an illusion, or when they say consciousness is an illusion. That's nonsensical. I mean, an illusion is something that is not what it appears to be, but it's not something that doesn't exist at all. They say it as if consciousness doesn't exist. And then when you challenge them, they'll say, well, that's not what I meant. I just meant it's not what it seems to be. But I don't have much patience for these so-called illusionists. Mm-hmm. I know Graziano is one of them, respectfully. Yeah, so that was just, so I brought that up, the physical thing. I'm saying there's a real clear definition of what physical means. It's going to be valid forever as long as we have science, because science is about predicting when things are going to happen in space and time. The next step is just to say feelings are not a property that moves things.
So feelings is not the property that moves. So that means that you're not including consciousness as a part of that space time.
It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean, so I can still say my mind is in my head. I'm not saying it can't be located in space. I'm saying it doesn't participate it doesn't push anything around. Physical properties push. Every physical property pushes or pulls or constrains where things can be. I'm saying consciousness is a non-physical property on its face, and that might seem problematic because it seems to mean that I can't decide to raise my arm. And it seems to bring me back to the epiphenomenalism problem that I said every classical model will have. If you see that, you can still imagine a zombie that would behave like me without the consciousness, but I argue it's not possible. It's conceivable, but it's not physically possible, because it's not possible to have these unified states if the physics is not unified, objectively unified.
If we're conscious beings and we're moving, consciousness is like our property. It's not, without consciousness, we won't be able to move. Humans won't be able to move. But even that's why I'm arguing that consciousness, to some extent, is like part of.
It is. It's a property of the physical system.
Even if we take like robots, robots that are not conscious, right? But they, through mechanics, they're still also moving.
Sure.
They're also part of that physical world,
right.
And they're not conscious. So
right. So in this picture, they still they are a physical system, and under this panpsychist view, they still have their material parts, still have a mental property, but it's all incoherent little electron empty ideas, maybe just thinking, I exist, I exist, I exist, or something like, like that. But in us, all those tiny little consciousnesses have been orchestrated into a big one. I don't know if I've communicated, if you've absorbed what I was trying to say about the epiphenomenalism thing. You know, it seems in this picture, because I just let me say it completely unambiguously. I'm saying yes, that consciousness is not what moves our body, and so this is not an interactionist theory. People talk about dualism and monism, and dualism is out of fashion, but usually what people are referring to is interactionist dualism, where you imagine there's some mind thing and it pushes on the body. In the way I just defined physical, that would be new physics, not a mind. If it's actually pushing on the pineal gland or something like Descartes thought, I would just call that new physics, because it's a physical property, moving things. But in the framework I'm taking, basically from Spinoza, they don't causally interact. Mind and matter don't causally interact, but they map onto each other. And so if you have a physical system that uses these holistic states to have a behavioral advantage, it has to come with this holistic consciousness.
But what about robots?
The robot might be able to imitate some of the functions, but it's doing it with, wooden levers where all its bits are not entangled into a meaningful unified quantum state. That's why it might perform the same or similar functions, but it won't be conscious. But that was also a way to say why I think the hard problem is really not just a vague intuition, but it's really almost a proof. Yeah. So I think of it as basically a proof, although people think of it as an intuition that is wrong. But I'm also pointing at the issue that the quantum model solves the problem, not only the binding problem that we mostly talked about, but the problem of how do you explain the evolution of consciousness? If according to the story, the metaphysical picture I just gave, it doesn't actually interact causally, then how can we explain that we evolved so that fire hurts? It seems like the consciousness is giving good advice to take your hand out of the fire, and it seems mysterious that it would be giving good advice if it can't actually help your body take your hand out of the fire. But in this picture, it's not the mental property per se that moves your hand. It's the objectively unified physical state or physical properties that it comes with. So that's why we can go back and forth between saying it was my desire that made my hand move up, not action potentials that made my hand move up. On a very technical level, it's just the action potentials that made my hand go up. But because the physical substrate is always matching the mental property, that's why we can talk colloquially about my desire is why I got up or why I raised my hand.